Hello and welcome to the inaugural Batman Friday of Superman Comic a Week. Probably going to end up having to change this channel name. So here on Batman Friday, we're going to be doing exactly what I've been doing with Superman Comic a Day. I'm going to recap and review a Batman comic starting with Detective Comics number 27, his first ever appearance, and mainly be doing Detective Comics and the main Batman series, depending on importance of other Batman comics, which do end up becoming important later on. Like, you have to read a whole bunch of stuff to even be able to follow several big storylines, especially when they start happening in the late 80s to 90s. But before we do that, I thought it was actually more important if we actually talk about Batman's creators. I sort of did this in the first episode of Superman Comic a Day when I was talking about Action Comics number 1. But I do think if we're going to talk about Batman and how Batman changes over the years, we need to kind of understand his creators, and especially what ends up making Batman different in a way he has the longevity versus a bunch of the other characters he was, if we're being nice, inspired from, if we're being honest, ripped off from. This is no secret. We know Batman had a lot of different influences, some almost identical to the Batman premise itself. So if we're talking about the creators of Batman, and we are talking about the creators of Batman, we have to start with Bob Kane. Born Robert Kahn, he changed his name as quickly as he could. It was said that he got a nose job as quickly as he could. Bob Kane's a little harder to talk about. There are no good Bob Kane stories, and by that I mean there is no story about how great Bob Kane is. Most stories about Bob Kane are how much of an asshole he was, or a liar, and as a source, Bob Kane is unreliable at best. But Bob Kane became an artist who started working in comics. He was already kind of co-creating, creating characters before Batman. I believe in Detective Comics even before Batman, he had a comic called Oscar the Gumshoe, but he had a few through the several anthology series that were already happening. When Superman became big, and when I say big, I mean big, National Comics, DC Comics, whatever you want to call the publisher at this time, was making a boatload of money off of him. And Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman, were making a lot of money compared to other comic book writers, but compared to how much money they should have been making, it was nowhere near what they should have been paid. But the publisher wanted more Superman, or something in the vein of a superhero premise. So a bunch of different writers and artists were trying to come up with the next Superman. And Bob Kane couldn't resist jumping into that fray. At this time, Bob Kane had his own studio, and here we get into the problems that is Bob Kane. Bob Kane would basically have a studio of artists and writers actually doing the work. There's some evidence that he did at least do his own art for a while in the beginning, but then it becomes very complicated to talk about how he probably wasn't doing his own art. I don't even know how much of his own art is actually in Batman. That is very debatable. He would say a lot more than there was. There's actually a chance that none of it was his. There's probably a good chance that he actually did do the first few issues of Batman. But essentially, Bob Kane would get paid and credited all the work while actually a studio of people would be doing the work, and then he would give less money to them, keeping his own big payout, which was probably not that big in most cases. When the publisher wanted a new superhero, Bob came up with Bat Hyphenated Man. And there's many comics and many different artworks you can find of the original design. He based it off of Da Vinci's Ornithopter. Wow, I think that came out wrong. Which was different flying machines he had designed, and one of them had kind of a guy in bird wings or bat wings. So Bob Kane's Batman hyphen, gotta remember that hyphen, had blonde hair. He did not wear a cape or cowl. He had a domino mask. He had bat wings, like legitimate bat wings. Not sure if they were going to work. They didn't look like they worked if you ever look at any of those designs. But essentially, over a weekend, he works with a writer friend he had made, Milton Finger, known professionally as Bill Finger. And that's the other main creator when we talk about Batman. And that becomes a complicated and at times sad story. Bill Finger was a shoe salesman part-time and a part-time writer, and he saw joining the studio as his chance to actually become a writer. So Bob and Bill work over the weekend, and we essentially get what we recognize as Batman, not completely. That would take time over the comics. But you get the cape and cowl, the dark costume. You have something that looks like Batman. And once it's published under Bob Kane's name, it does become popular, but not as popular as Superman. Maybe half as popular at best until, as I said in my last Batman video, the 60s TV show. And now once we get to talking about Batman, as I've said, we know he's a ripoff of a bunch of different characters. Zorro, there was an actual bat character who was a rich man pretending to be a crime fighter who dressed like a bat. It was a silent movie at the time. There was the Shadow who had his own radio show, and Batman was basically like the Shadow. But I don't want to focus on that right now. What I really want to focus on is what ends up making Batman different. And essentially it comes down to like two key factors. One is Batman at the beginning does in fact use a gun. But Whitney Ellsworth, who was an editor, who had worked at National at the beginning but left for a while, and now he had come back and he had a very strict editorial mandate. He really controlled these books. He was a major in World War I, retired at this point, but he's the one who basically says it's kind of ridiculous if Bruce Wayne's parents are shot and killed with a gun that Batman uses a gun. This ends up forcing the writers to come up with better ideas of how to deal with the criminals. So this is where we get the whole bat gadgets and all the cool things that we love about Batman. A lot of that ends up being created by Gardner Fox, who ends up filling in for Bill Finger for a while because Bill Finger wasn't exactly the fastest writer. Like the utility belt is Gardner Fox. But once Bill returns, the Batcave and the Batmobile are very much Bill creations. And the very important part when it comes to talking about Bill Finger is Bill Finger used to keep a journal full of gimmicks. And this is how a lot of the Batman villains get created. These sort of unique, very larger than life, inherently silly. These are comic books. And I know you people love dark and gritty Batman, but comics are inherently silly. These inherently silly villains with these gimmicks who would come up with like a death trap that matched their theme that Batman's going to get out of through some sort of bat-themed gadget in his utility belt. It's what made him unique. It's what made him fun. We remember the part about Batman being fun. And honestly, that's why he became popular and why he ends up continuing in a way where I bet some of you have never even heard of the Shadow. He had one really bad movie in the early 90s and we don't particularly talk about him. He does get like a comic series every now and then, but Batman remains. And honestly, that's all we really would have to talk about when it comes to these creators. But there is more to this story. As comic conventions became a thing, Bill Finger started showing up, and Bob Kane not being the full creator of Batman, or not even doing the artwork as he was still being credited for a while, was a very poorly kept secret in the industry. Once people are meeting people who work in comics at comic conventions and Bill Finger kind of showing up at them and not being really well known, word starts to go out. I wouldn't say a lot of people know about it, but whispers are starting, which kind of pisses off Bob Kane. And like I said about Bob Kane, there aren't any good stories about Bob Kane. I can tell about how him and Jim Steranko met, and he kept slightly slapping Jim Steranko to a point that Jim Steranko tried to punch him, or that Stan Lee would say they would go out to dinner and Bob couldn't wait to impress the waitress by telling the waitress that he was the creator of Batman. If you really want to find out the ego on Bob Kane, you should look up his tombstone. Just wow. There's even a story about him thinking that clown paintings were what he was going to be remembered for, and it turning out that he was paying another artist to do the paintings. That was who Bob Kane was. Bill Finger unfortunately dies in the 1970s. He is basically near poverty and is mostly unremembered at that point. He does have one credit in Batman at the time. He did get to write a Batman 66 Adam West Show episode about the Clock King, who his co-writer, whose name usually went first on the credits, said that Bill actually sheepishly asked him if his name could go first this only time, which, yeah, is fairly sad. In the 80s, as the story becomes more and more apparent, Bob Kane writes an autobiography called Batman and Me, where now that because Bill Finger is dead, he sort of says he has remorse over the fact that he didn't give credit to Bill. Not enough to actually give credit to Bill, but to say he felt sort of bad about it. Trying to make himself look better. and this is where we really need to talk about how he is not a trustworthy source. There is artwork in this autobiography that was later found to be forged. He was changing dates to make himself look like he had created more about Batman than he did, to try to kind of end the conversation that Bill was as important to creating Batman as it was starting to come out. Other artists and writers with the ability to look at the DC archives eventually kind of discover this by looking at it. That's just kind of who Bob Kane was. And that story might have ended there, but in the 2000s, a author by the name Mark Tyler Nobleman does a lot of research and does an entire children's picture book about Bill Finger called Bill the Wonder Boy, the Secret Co-Creator of Batman, to try to get that word out that Bill Finger was the actual co-creator of Batman. He then actually starts up the kind of campaign to give Bill the credit. But, not being a living relative of Bill Finger, he cannot challenge this in court, or really do anything. So there is a documentary about this journey called Batman and Bill that is a Hulu original, and if you have Hulu, I would recommend watching it. It's fine, it focuses way too much on Nobleman, when you really want it to be focused on Bill. But essentially, Nobleman ends up finding out that Bill did have a granddaughter. He knew about Bill's son, but Bill's son died of AIDS in the 90s, so we kind of assumed that there was no grandchildren. And once she is discovered, DC and Warner Brothers quickly acts. They try to give her some money. They invite her to the Dark Knight premiere. She very quickly really wants to get her grandfather credit for creating Batman. As she becomes more and more vocal, eventually Warner Brothers and DC wants to deal. And after one big meeting with lawyers, Bill Finger is officially credited as co-creator of Batman. So if you ever watch anything with Batman made after 2016, the very first thing being Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, you will see a credit, Batman created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, like it should have been all the way back in 39, but the 40s to now. So that's kind of a happy ending. Sadly, Bill never lived to see himself credited as the creator of Batman. But the reason I want to do this video is you should keep all of that in mind when we do, in fact, actually talk about Batman. And we will be talking about Batman next Friday. So for Superman Comic a Week, here on Bat Fridays, please like and subscribe these videos if you enjoy them. Hit the bell icon to receive notifications when a new video comes up. I do these Monday through Friday, and Fridays will now be Bat Friday. And I will talk to you guys next Monday.